Hello everyone, my name is Dalton Jenkins and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on chapter 51 of our textbook titled Animal Behavior. First I want to define behavior. In all animals, form and physiology are closely linked to behaviors, which are defined as any actions, voluntary or involuntary, that are carried out by an animal through contractions of muscles in response to signals produced and carried by the nervous system. The study of the ecological and evolutionary causes for specific behaviors is referred to as behavioral ecology. For example, the huddling together of honeybees to conserve heat in response to a drop in temperature is an example of a behavior. Now let's talk about behavior stimulated by discrete sensory inputs, starting with fixed action patterns. The term fixed action pattern refers to the automatic, involuntary behavioral responses that some animals exhibit in response to simple stimuli known as sign stimuli. For example, male stickleback fishes will automatically display aggressive behavior when stimulated by the color red, which acts as the sign stimulus, because other male sticklebacks have red-colored undersides. Next, we'll talk about migration. Migration refers to the sum of an animal's behavioral processes that facilitate a long-distance location change as a response to external stimuli and environmental cues. Furthermore, migration is guided and directed by a combination of external stimuli and biological clocks. Which brings us to behavioral rhythms. Biological clocks control many facets of animal behavior, and circadian rhythms are biological clocks based around 24-hour intervals that are typically influenced by environmental cycles of light and dark. However, the rhythm can be maintained in the absence of environmental cues. Circannual rhythms are biological rhythms that are influenced by the variations in available daylight that come with the changing seasons, and these rhythms influence behavior such as migration and reproduction. Next, we'll talk about animal signals and communication. Communication within the context of this chapter refers to the sum of the processes by which individual animals send and receive stimuli, also known as signals, to and from one another, and the behaviors that are elicited as responses to these signals. There are 4 common mechanisms of communication between animals, and I'll be using a stepwise breakdown of fruit fly courtship behavior as an example. The first is visual communication. A male fruit fly visually detects a female fruit fly and turns to face her, which brings us to chemical communication. The male fruit fly detects pheromones released by the female to ensure they are of the same species. Next is tactile communication. The male fruit fly then alerts the female to his presence by touching the female with a foreleg. And then we have auditory communication finally. The male produces an auditory stimulus by vibrating a single wing, and this stimulus allows the female to determine whether or not the male is of the same species. If and only if all forms of communication are successful, the female will allow the male to copulate. Because each action in the example I just discussed is a response to a stimulus and acts as a stimulus that elicits the next response, the series of events comprises a stimulus-response chain. And the evolution of communication methods is closely tied to a species' lifestyle. For example, nocturnal animals typically employ mechanisms of communication that do not involve visual stimuli, and diurnal animals often use visual forms of communication. Moving on to links between experience and behavior. I'll start by defining what innate behavior is. Behaviors that are not learned but are ingrained into an animal during development and are performed in the same way each and every time, regardless of learning or experience, are referred to as innate behaviors. For example, a spider's web-building behaviors and an infant mammal's suckling reflex are innate behaviors. Now we can discuss the links between experience and behavior. Experience can influence many different behavioral mechanisms in animals, and cross-fostering studies are very useful in researching this phenomenon. Cross-fostering studies are experiments conducted by placing the young of one species into the care of adults from another species and analyzing the effects of the irregular environments on behaviors that are common in each species. For example, male white-footed mice raised by California mice display behaviors that more closely match those commonly exhibited by adult California mice than adult white-footed mice. Finally, on this slide, we'll talk about learning. Learning refers to the mechanisms by which experiences are stored as memories and by which memories influence changes in an animal's behavior. Furthermore, an animal's capacity for learning is determined by the organization and development of the animal's nervous system during the animal's development. Next, I'll discuss several mechanisms of learning, starting with imprinting. Imprinting is a learning mechanism common in many animal species through which offspring learn to recognize and emulate their parents to increase their chances of survival. Additionally, imprinting is only possible during a period of time known as the sensitive period, which varies in duration from species to species. Next is spatial learning. Spatial learning is a learning mechanism through which animals develop and use memories of their surroundings to increase their fitness by understanding the spatial relationships of objects in their environments. Additionally, many animals display spatial learning through the development of a cognitive map, which is a representation of their environment's spatial structure stored within the nervous system. Moving on to associative learning. Associative learning is a learning mechanism through which animals use memories of their experiences to make associations between different environmental features. For example, some animals can learn to associate specific odors with illness-causing foods and use their understanding of this association to avoid illness-causing foods in the future. Next is cognition. Cognition is a complex learning mechanism that was once thought to be exclusive to some primates and some marine mammals, through which animals use memories of their experiences in coordination with aspects of knowledge including awareness, reasoning, and judgment to perform cognitive processes such as problem solving. Problem solving is a process exhibited by some animals and is characterized by the formulation of a method that allows the animal to go from a starting condition to a desired condition in the face of obstacles. And finally, we have social learning, which is a learning mechanism through which animals learn new behaviors and the consequences of these behaviors through the observation of adults belonging to the same species. Furthermore, culture is a widely accepted collection of behaviors and beliefs that are passed down through social learning within a population. Finally, here I have this figure that depicts a maze test of abstract thinking by honeybees. Bees were trained in a color maze. Some of the bees were rewarded for choosing the door that matched the stimulus. So they come in, the stimulus is blue. If they choose the blue door, they get a food reward. Next, they come into the pattern maze, and if they were previously rewarded for choosing the door that matched the stimulus, they were more likely to choose the door that matched the stimulus in the pattern maze as well, because they have associated sameness with a food reward. Moving on to diverse behaviors related to selection, starting with the evolution of foraging behavior. All animals are heterotrophic, which implies they must all exhibit behaviors that involve the acquirement of food, behaviors that are also known as foraging behaviors. Additionally, foraging behaviors exist as a compromise between the benefits and costs of obtaining food, and the optimal foraging model suggests that natural selection should support foraging behaviors that contribute to the optimization of this cost-benefit analysis. Balancing risk and reward. Behaviors displayed by animals are often products of a compromise made in the face of many selective pressures. For example, mule deer tend to forage in open areas to avoid higher risks of predation in heavily forested areas, despite a lower availability of food in the more open areas. Moving on to mate behavior and mate choice. First, I'll define monogamy, polygamy, and sexual dimorphism. Monogamy refers to the mating systems present in some animal species that are not promiscuous and involves pair bonding between a single individual of each sex for some duration of time. Polygamy refers to the mating systems present in some animal species that are not promiscuous and involve bonding between a single individual of one sex and multiple individuals belonging to the opposite sex. Additionally, if a polygamous relationship involves a single male and multiple females, it is referred to as polygyny, and if the relationship involves a single female and multiple males, it is referred to as polyandry. Sexual dimorphism refers to the visual differences displayed between males and females of the same species. Monogamous species tend to produce males and females that look very similar, while polygamous species tend to produce more flamboyant males if the species displays polygyny, or more flamboyant females if the species displays polyandry. Talk about the links between mating systems and parental care. The needs of the offspring produced by a particular species generally have a strong influence over the parental care displayed by the species. For example, in species that produce offspring that are unable to care for themselves, males may form monogamous relationships and assist in parental care because increasing the viability of their offspring greatly improves their chances of reproductive success than finding more mates would. While males belonging to a species that produces offspring that are generally able to care for themselves shortly after birth are more likely to form polygamous relationships or display promiscuous mating behaviors to increase their reproductive success. Moving on to sexual selection and mate choice. Sexual selection can be broken down into intersexual selection, which involves the choosing of mates based on characteristics present in prospective mates of the opposite sex, and intrasexual selection. Intrasexual selection involves internal competition between members of the same sex for mates. Let's talk about mate choice by females. Mating preferences displayed by females are thought to heavily influence the evolutionary formation of male behavior and anatomy. Characteristics that are favored by females are typically representative of health and vitality in their mates, which increases the probability of producing strong offspring that will be healthy and have high chances of reproductive success themselves. Mate choice copying is a social learning mechanism through which an individual belonging to a specific species will consider and emulate the mate choices of other individuals, sometimes in spite of the highly desired mate's lack of specific attractive characteristics. This is hypothesized to occur because mating with an individual that is attractive to members of the opposite sex increases the chance of creating reproductively successful offspring. Moving on to male competition for mates, males display intrasexual selection through agnostic behaviors, which take the form of ritualized contests that grant the winner access to the resource being competed for. In this context, that resource is mates. Male competition for mates can be better understood by applying game theory. John Nash, along with other individuals, is credited with the development of game theory, which is a representation of economic behavior displayed by humans, as well as an analysis of alternative strategies when faced with possible outcomes that are dependent on the strategies of all individuals involved. Furthermore, game theory can be used to reason through complex evolutionary questions that are contingent upon the performance of an individual in relation to the performances of other individuals. For example, game theory can be applied to formulate a hypothesis that explains the varying physical characteristics of male side-blotched lizards, none of which have been exclusively favored by natural selection. Some males have orange-colored throats, these guys over here. They are hyper-aggressive and defend large groups of females. Some males have blue-colored throats, guy right here. They are relatively less territorial than the orange throats, and they defend small groups of females. And finally, this guy over here, some males have yellow-colored throats. They are not territorial, and they find chances to mate by emulating females. In a rock, paper, scissors style matchup, each of these possible groups of males has an advantage over one other group and is at a disadvantage against the other group. Blue throats can defend their small groups against sneaky yellow throats, but will be overwhelmed by the more aggressive orange throats. Orange throats can defeat the blue throats, but their large groups of females make it easier for the sneaky yellow throats to infiltrate and mate successfully. Yellow throats can sneak by orange throats, but will be defeated by blue throats that guard smaller groups of females. And finally, that brings us to the evolution of behavior, starting with the concept of altruism. Altruism, within the context of this chapter, refers to selfless behaviors displayed by individual members of an animal population that actively diminish the performer's fitness while serving to increase the fitness of other members belonging to the same population. Inclusive fitness refers to the sum results of the processes by which an animal increases its genetic presence within a population. This includes producing offspring and giving aid to closely related individuals, even in spite of personal safety, to promote their chances of surviving and producing offspring of their own. That brings us to Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule is a concept that measures how likely an act of altruism is to be favored by natural selection by comparing the cost of the act, measured in the loss of potential offspring produced by the altruist, with the coefficient of relatedness, the approximate fraction of genes shared between the altruist and the recipient, multiplied by the benefit, which is measured by the average number of offspring the recipient produces after the altruistic act. Altruism is favored by natural selection when the product of the benefit and coefficient of relatedness exceeds the value of the cost. Kin selection is a form of natural selection that specifically favors the propagation of genes that contribute to altruistic behavior. This is because of the increase in genetic representation within a population that comes with promoting the reproductive success of an individual's relatives by the individual. And finally, we'll talk about reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism is a phenomenon that is largely limited to animal species that form complex and stable social groups and is characterized by an exchange of altruistic behaviors between individuals that are not genetically related. Additionally, reciprocal altruism among animal populations largely relies on tit-for-tat strategies that are outlined by game theory. Tit for tat strategies are displayed when individuals treat other individuals in the same way they were treated during the previous meeting. And that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.